Well, this is our part two of urban geography, and I think this particular lecture is going to be relatively short. I think I've said that before, but this time I mean it. I think we're going to end up with four lectures about urban geography, but some of them will be a little short. But in any case, we'll cover all the material. I just want to review here the first urban geography lecture, where we talked about three models of city structure: Burgess's concentric zone model, the rings; Hoyt's sector model, like slices of pizza; and Harris and Ullman's multiple nuclei model, districts scattered around the urban area. We saw that all three bear some resemblance to reality. That is, cities have some aspects of all three urban models. Starting with Hoyt, we saw that high, low, and middle income sectors and transportation corridors tend to be in wedges or sectors, especially along those transportation corridors. And we mentioned that um, high, pretty much all cities retain a high income sector no matter what happens downtown, no matter office buildings, low income apartment housing, whatever, there will usually be a high income sector. And what's interesting in the United States and the northern, in general, this is true in Europe too. This is not a course in physical geography, but there's an interesting aspect to this. We in North America are generally in a westerly wind belt. Winds are named for where they come from. So a westerly wind means it's coming from the west. The sea breeze means it's coming from the sea. So when you're at the ocean during the day, the breeze comes from the water. It's called the sea breeze. At night, that reverses, and actually the breeze comes from the land toward the ocean. That's called the land breeze. But anyway, so we're in a westerly wind belt, and generally pretty much throughout the latitude, pretty much all the latitude of the United States and southern Canada. And you see this, by the way, if you enjoy watching the weather on TV or on the web or whatever. You see storms travel from west to east, and we get, storm forms over near the Rockies somewhere, and then it moves to the east, coming from the west through the Ohio. First Chicago gets it, then it comes to Ohio Valley, and then it moves on to New England. That's part of this generally westerly wind trend. It's steered by the jet stream. You may have heard of that. It's a moving kind of belt of high air that directs these westerly winds and the storms and so forth. The point this has to do with urban geography is that because in the United States winds tend to go west to the east, if you look back in history at these high-income neighborhoods, you see they generally tend to be on the western side of cities, because the eastern side, go back to the days of dirty factories, and you've seen a couple of slides of those before any laws about air pollution or anything. You'd have a factory burning coal and so on. That soot and smoke and odor and everything went to the east generally. And generally, the high-income folks would stay on the west side of town, and the land values on the eastern side of town would be generally lower. So who was able to afford places there near the factories? Well, it was low-income folks. And it's still amazing today how much you see. It's not always true, because there are sometimes it's reversed. But generally it is true. If you go to Washington, D.C., Northwest D.C. has always been the high-income sector, extending out to the suburbs, and southeastern D.C. has been the Anacostia, it's called, the low-income neighborhoods. If you have your choice, don't live in East whatever, East Chicago, steel plants, a lot of low-income housing. East Providence, Rhode Island is dumpy. West Providence, nice neighborhoods. East Hartford, Connecticut, dumpy. West, East St. Louis um, is an area of a lot of low income, whereas the western side of town has better housing and so forth. And again, it's not always true, but some of this can be traced back to the location of factories. And if you wanted to be on the west side of town, so all that stuff didn't blow over you. So that's a comment about the high income wedges and so on. The zone model is partly true, or gives us part of the truth of a city, so to speak. In that we talked about those rings reflecting the family cycle, and a lot of single people in the center. Families with kids want to move out to the outer ring, whether it's within the city itself or in the adjoining suburbs. And then the blocks or districts, the checkerboard pattern with the online textbook calls the Kino pattern, just means you have districts. Sometimes they're industrial districts, industrial parks, warehouse districts. Sometimes they're ethnic communities, Chinatown, African American, German village, or whatever. So all of them have some aspect to them. All the cities do. Latin America is a little bit different, and this would be true. I said, the cities are more similar in the United States and in Europe. In the developing countries like Latin America, Africa, and some in Southeast Asia, like the Philippines, where folks, and maybe the difference is in the auto, not as many folks had automobiles as early, because of course the United States and Europe had more money, were wealthier. Everybody got automobiles much quicker than in the Latin America and Africa. And what happened there was, while you do have in many cities now American-style suburbs, what tended to happen though was that the higher income people stayed more in the city, and the periphery, the outer rings, the suburbs, were occupied by the low income folks. Oftentimes these were squatter settlements. Squatter settlements means that folks just took over the land, and kind of nobody stopped them. They couldn't afford to buy it. And this has been a tradition in much of Latin America. It's almost what you'd say institutionalized, where folks take over adjoining land, and eventually the government does not throw them out because it leads to too much violence and bloodshed and so on. I mean, this has happened over history, and eventually they do let them stay there, and then eventually they bring in electricity, or folks, a lot of times in third world countries, folks illegally get electricity, and nobody really shuts it off to them, but they tap into wires and so on, and get basically free electricity. So this particular model is what the Latin American city looks like. The folks who talked about this were two people named Ford and Griffin. So sometimes it's called the Ford-Griffin model. But the point is, the outside ring is the most different from what Americans are used to seeing. They're calling it the perifico, I guess, meaning like periphery. Then you see some sectors there, your disamenity. Remember, that means that amenity means the nice things of life. Disamenity means the bad things. So those would be like industrial corridors, with heavy industry, railroads, and so on. Still has a central business district. Nowadays there'll be a mall, of course, in addition to the downtown CBD. And the blues here, or the purplish color, is the elite residential sector. And you see in this case it extends all the way from the downtown out to the suburbs. But it doesn't occupy all of the suburbs, because the poor folks get out there and built the shanty towns first. So that's a way, and this is true in both Latin America and to an extent in Africa as well. The zone of maturity, we won't go into all these categories, but that's maturity, of course, that would mean the older city that would be like the zone of retreat or the zone of decay we talked about on that other diagram. Although there is always, and you see the lime green color, and hopefully these colors are showing up reasonably well on your video. That's gentrification. Remember what gentrification means. That means where higher income people are moving in and displacing the folks who live there, usually lower income people. And it's kind of the opposite of what goes on in the zone of maturity, where it's quite possible. If you look at even a town like Maple, you see where a town like Zanesville along Maple Avenue, you see that these what were beautiful homes at one time have been taken over now as a fortune teller and a chiropractor and things like that. So the city is always things are always changing in the city. So you have nice neighborhoods that are being taken over by business or being subdivided into rental apartments and lower income folks moving in. But gentrification is kind of the reverse of that. It means that wealthier people are coming back because in the end, people do like to live in cities. And, as long as there's housing available and they feel secure and they can commute to their jobs, people want to live in cities. Here's a picture from Latin America. This is Buenos Aires, which is in the biggest city and primate city, capital of Argentina. And it's sometimes called the Paris of the Southern Hemisphere because it early on get into the game of planning very wide avenues. So those broad avenues and a lot of monuments and things make it look like Paris, some folks say. So it's been called the Paris of the Southern Hemisphere. And you've also seen a video about this, about how they're trying to kind of take back the city for pedestrians and having the bicycle paths and free bicycle renting, or not even renting, but free bicycle usage programs. But the reason I show this particular slide is it's a good example of how you see, this is a pretty nice neighborhood we see in front with all these trees. That's not a slum. You can tell those are fairly big houses and surrounded by trees, and yet you see right behind it is the high rise. So this would be the high rises. So this would be where that higher income elite neighborhood meets literally the downtown CBD. And since we're talking about Buenos Aires, and I wanted to talk about density, I use that as an example. So you see the map on the left shows the whole country of Argentina. And from when I think I used Buenos Aires as an example of a primate city. But you see that this is the population density in the country as a whole. The very dark, almost black colors are the highest density, and the reds and so on. And you see it's very much true that the population is very distinctly concentrated around Buenos Aires. Along this little bay here, it's called Rio de la Plata, between Argentina and Uruguay. And there's a couple of other cities like Rosario and Mendoza and so forth, but Buenos Aires is the big dog. And then when you look at the Buenos Aires area in detail, you see how much, how very dense it is, particularly in the urban area itself and its adjoining suburbs. So we're looking at a couple of slides about urban density in cities. These are the squatter settlements. They have different names in different countries. These are in Brazil. They're called favellas, which you see spelled there. This is outside of Rio de Janeiro. And you see a couple of things, and you may have seen some of these if you follow any of the World Cup soccer. That was in Rio, and they redid a lot of, well, it was held all over Brazil, actually, but a lot of it in Rio. And literally, folks build these homes, and over time, they start, a lot of times they start out there almost like cardboard shacks or tar paper shacks, or covered over with the those blue plastic tarps, and you build a little frame, and little by little you improve it. You start putting concrete blocks in to support it. You buy plywood instead of the plastic, and some of these eventually become fairly decent neighborhoods. But they are so densely packed that there are hardly any roads, and you see in around, particularly in Brazil, where a lot of the big cities are on the coast, which is where the hills come down to the water. Um, you literally might, some of these folks might literally spend 45 minutes walking up. A lot of times these places are too narrow to get trucks in, and you can see folks walking up the walkways here. So somebody like a maid or something who lives up here and works in an office building downtown, maybe she's a custodian or something, or a maid for one of the wealthy people, she may spend an hour climbing up and down this hill because oftentimes the roads aren't wide enough to get trucks and buses up there. And think about this, what this means if you buy a sofa, right? You save a little money and you buy a sofa at the Brazilian equivalent of odd lots. You got to get a couple of your buddies to help you carry this, spend a whole Saturday carrying this thing up the hill to get it into your house. There's an expression in Brazil about what is it? The law ends where the pavement ends, meaning as you go into these hillside favelas, when the pavement ends, it means kind of like city control has ended there. And literally what happens in some of these slums is like drug dealers run them. Basically, they are the law. And the police, little by little, the police expand their territory. They come in with SWAT teams, pave a quarter mile of road, and then that area will become settled. They'll start charging people for the electricity. They'll provide a natural gas pipeline or whatever. But so the law and the authority eventually comes into these areas, and as I said, sometimes they can become very nice neighborhoods over time, a little crowded, but the housing and so on can become very nice over time. The other danger around the world, wherever you have this kind of construction on hillsides, is mudslides. And every year you will read about, mudslide in Rio kills 400 people or something, because the rains, the heavy rains on these hillsides washes out earth. These buildings collapse. They don't have proper foundations. I mean, even with proper foundations in California, you can have mudslides and you can have houses slide downhill. If you're just kind of building a structure starting with concrete blocks on the ground, no basement, no foundation, they're very vulnerable. And every year, unfortunately, I mean, people get killed in these places. Philippines, in this case, you see the same thing on the left. Literally shanty towns in the favelas is in Brazil. Remember, that's Portuguese. The Spanish word, which in Philippines also speaks as an official language of Spanish. They call them barriadas. Kind of, it's related to barrio, although barrio simply means the neighborhood. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a shanty town or slum neighborhood, but a barriada does mean, in the Spanish-speaking world, like a slum neighborhood. And you see on the left the type of construction. In this case, this is in Manila in the Philippines. Manila is the big city, capital of the Philippines. You see literally these are squatter settlements built right along the ocean. And you can imagine if a hurricane comes along, and that the Philippines does get, hurricanes like that literally probably these would disappear until the hurricane is over. Then folks will come back and rebuild them. And speaking of density, so here's an example of New York. Density in land values. So this is a map of New York City. And this area, you may recognize it already, the red, the highest values are Manhattan Island, where a lot of the high rises are, and this the value of the land and so forth corresponds with density and accessibility. The main point I'm trying to make with this map is you may be thinking, well, oh yeah, that land is valuable because that's where all the skyscrapers are. Um, think of it instead this way. The skyscrapers are there because that's where the valuable land is, and it's valuable because that's where the most accessibility and the highest density is. Anytime you're in a city, the price of the land, as this map shows, reflects people's willingness to pay for it. So they're willing to pay a lot of money if you're accessible. Let's say you want to build a shopping mall, something like New York. Have shopping malls, but they're in high rises. They're not in suburban style, and not in New York City. But it's almost like the value of the land reflects the height of those buildings. If you made a little bar graph and you said, all right, how much is it? I'm going to make a little kind of a 3D graph out of pieces of wood, and the height of the wood will reflect the value of the land. So here it's, $2,000 per square foot or something, and here it's 1,000. So you make that your model would look like the skyscrapers. The height of the skyscrapers reflects the value of the land. Is the point I'm trying to make, and the value of the land reflects its accessibility to the, how many people can get to it. If you're off in a corner somewhere, that land is not as valuable as if you're, right downtown where everybody can get to you from every direction. And that is true. We're going from, Buenos Aires in New York. I just pulled a sample picture here because I have to see this population density map. Here's a small city. I don't know if it's much bigger than like Zanesville or Athens, but La Crosse, Wisconsin, it looks like, the picture kind of looks like the size of a town like Zanesville or Chillicothe or Lancaster. And but you see the same principles are true. Here's a map of population density. Here is the downtown with this square indicating it. That's what the downtown looks like. And you see that's how cities develop. They're centers of density. And that higher density than near the downtown, is where you have your your taller buildings because you got to pay for that land. So you got to stick 2 or 3 floors there instead of just one to get the value of the land back. Now that being said, there also is, I should say, particularly in big cities, you do sometimes actually have a hollow population in the center, because if you're almost like Wall Street, let's say, if you're almost entirely office buildings and you do not have any high-rise apartment buildings or luxury condominiums, you literally may have a kind of a hollow spot in the very center of the city, because after all, it is the central business district, not the central residential district. So if your downtown gets taken over by office buildings, that actually in the kind of like a donut in the very, very center, they may be actually hollow population density or very little population density. More true in bigger cities usually. If we look at population density across the United States, I like this particular map because of the way they showed population density as like mountains. And so, of course, these mountains are basically urban areas. And there's my cursor, and you see this is a particularly good map, I think, because you see the megalopolis we talked about. So here's like Boston and Hartford, Providence, and then New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C. And you see very clearly that's almost, I guess you'd call it a little mountain chain, so to speak, that these cities have grown into each other. And then to some extent you have that with Pittsburgh, the Great Lakes cluster, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, and then Chicago. Then you have kind of outliers or islands, like this would be Minneapolis up here. And by the way, here would be, I guess this would be Columbus, Cincinnati, and Indianapolis. So this cluster almost makes like a ring around Ohio, so to speak. And then you have like your St. Louis and Kansas City. Um, Texas, you see the kind of triangle here, Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Austin. You see a cluster in Florida, of course. We have Miami, Jacksonville, Tampa, and then you see on the West Coast, of course, and you see distinctly Southern California and Northern California. That is LA and San Diego here, and then San Francisco. And then you see Portland and Seattle, and a couple of islands. The rest of the West is pretty low density, with exceptions of like Denver, Salt Lake. This, of course, is Las Vegas. And then you have the two Arizona cities, Phoenix and Tucson, and some others. But I thought that was an interesting map, and it shows how each of these peaks, so to speak, of population density represents an urban area and its surrounding hinterland. The hinterland means not just the suburbs, but the area of population that commutes in to the city, like to use an airport, to use the big hospitals, to come to the malls, and so forth. That's called the city's hinterland. In switching into a map now without the population density. Now this is what geographers call a proportional circle map. You've seen these where you make the circle reflect the size. So New York has the biggest circle because the diameter of the circle reflects the size of the city. So here's again Boston through Washington D.C. Cluster of cities growing in, and a whole bunch of other little cities. You see all these other dots here, like Portland, Maine, for example, or whatever. So you see that as a cluster. You see a very distinct cluster around the Great Lakes, and not just in the United States, but lopping over or overlapping over into Toronto and places like Windsor, Ontario, across the river from Detroit. You see Florida developing as a what this map is calling mega region or megalopolis. You see the strip of Gulf Coast cities from starting over in really almost the edge of Florida here, but Alabama, Mississippi, New Orleans, and then almost combining with the Texas Triangle that we've mentioned a couple of times. And some of these are more developing, and those we've mentioned are pretty much already there. The Front Range, meaning along the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains, is more developing because right now we largely have Denver and Colorado Springs, but you could say there's a megalopolis developing here, and maybe in 20 or 50 years it'll be more true. They're calling this the Arizona, the Phoenix, Tucson triangle, the Arizona Sun Corridor. Then, of course, you see distinctly Northern California, and then they're calling it Cascadia, named for the Cascade Mountain ranges. And there's one other, which is that there is a cluster of cities developing, smaller cities, although Atlanta is very big, but ranging from Birmingham, Alabama, through Atlanta. In Birmingham, by the way, we haven't talked much about that, but Birmingham was the South's Pittsburgh. They had both good coal deposits and good iron deposits, although the same thing happened. This is Birmingham, Alabama. The same thing happened in Pittsburgh, which is, they ran out of high quality iron ore, and then they ran out of local coal, and little by little, imported steel started replacing it and so forth. But anyway, back to this corridor. They call it the Piedmont Corridor, and it's kind of from North Carolina, the Research Triangle area of North Carolina, like where Duke is. A lot of colleges are there, Duke and University of North Carolina and so on. But basically through Raleigh, Charlotte, a lot of the textile cities and carpet cities are in in here, and then to Atlanta, and then to Birmingham. So that's a kind of developing mega region or developing megalopolis. And same thing is true in Europe and Asia, particularly not. And I suppose we could put a map up of South to some extent. You could see this in Latin America, along like the northern coast, in Venezuela and Colombia, and certainly in Brazil. But anyway, and you can make up names for them. They've come up with some cute names here, like Glassberg, meaning Glasgow, and Edinburgh, and Ambrostorp, meaning Amsterdam, and Brussels, and so forth. But anyway, to a large extent in Europe, there is a mega region across northern France through the three Low Countries, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, to Germany. And then certainly over the English Channel in Britain or the United Kingdom. Those are big industrial areas. And then, of course, Rome, particularly Rome, Italy, particularly northern Italy, where Turin and Milan are, more so than southern Italy. And then you can see others along the coast. Remember when we saw the lights along in that nighttime map? We saw the lights along the coast of the Mediterranean, and you can see that there's much more population density and urbanization there than inland. And then in Asia, these are two superimposed maps. This is India, and you can define a few clusters in India, like up in Delhi, where the capital is, and Mumbai, which was the new name for what would be Bombay. And you see this also of course, in South Korea, in Japan, almost all of Japan. Almost all of Japan is part of this mega region, really, because you get 130 million people living on a fairly small area. I think Japan's about the size of California, and California has like 35 million, but here they have more than 100 million people crammed into a similar size area. And then you see some mega regions developing in China around Beijing, the capital, and Shanghai on the coast, and so on. So the mega regions are a worldwide phenomenon. Back to an example of the United States, because we're actually going backwards a little bit. We've had all this buildup about all the urbanization and so on, to the point where metropolitan statistical areas at some states, particularly smaller states on the East Coast, like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, almost all their territory is within metropolitan statistical areas. So basically, they're 100% urbanized. I mean, they can't get any more urbanized because everybody already literally lives in a city or within reach of a city. I mean, obviously, you have some people on farms, but 10-minute commute, you're in some type of urban center. But the reason I say, and anyway, you can see, you have Boston and Worcester. There's three big, Boston, and then Worcester and Springfield. And of course you have overlapping. Remember the thing about many metro areas overlap state boundaries. So this blue area here is actually part of Providence, Rhode Island. And these are the two areas that were shown in the Portuguese community, New Bedford and Fall River. And then the two islands off the coast, Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, you may have heard of, and of course the arm there, Cape Cod. But I say all that actually to bring us back to where we started. And I think that one of the very first things I said on the first lecture about urban geography was, but in the end, only about the actual urbanized land, the actual urbanized land which is covered over in a parking lot or housing or gas station or something, is still only about 3% of the United States. And so I used this map of New England again right after I showed you that, you know, um, this is Massachusetts. This is southern New England. Massachusetts. Here's Connecticut here. Here's Rhode Island. I'm not sure why the boundary doesn't show, but there's a boundary between Rhode Island and Connecticut. It's right about there. Um, those bluish gray areas are where the actual cities are, and this is true satellite photos. So, here's Boston. Here's those same cities we talked about: Boston, Worcester, Springfield, Providence, and Hartford, and so forth. But the point is, this, Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island, and then New Jersey are like the absolute most densely populated areas in the United States. And yet, if you fly over this area, or even when you drive through on interstates, a lot of times you're saying, boy, where are the people? We've been driving through woods now for 10 minutes. And it's because these cities they don't take up huge amounts of areas. And actually in New England, a lot of the land is returning. New England has more forested land now because so many farms have been abandoned. There's a geography quote that about land and farmland in New England. Said that the story of agriculture in New England is the story of retreat from farmland that should have never been farmed in the first place, because it's so far north. It was so rocky. It's not a good climate to grow. I mean, you can grow all kinds of things, but to grow, you're not going to grow corn, maybe sweet corn, because you can sell it in your driveway. Or, eggs. Remember the von Thunen model. What type of agriculture succeeds in New England? It'd be the high intensity, the market gardens, tomatoes and watermelons and sweet corn that you sell at farmers markets. Or dairying and eggs and chickens kind of thing. You're not going to, I don't even know what the biggest farm is in New England. It'd be nothing compared to what you see out in the Midwest and in places like Iowa and Illinois. But anyway, back to the story about the forestry. At the time of the American Revolution, only about 10% of southern New England was forested, because everybody had chopped down all those trees to use them to sell them, to furniture, build houses, clear the land for agriculture, burn the wood for fuel, shipbuilding. They made, ships took 1,000 trees or whatever to build a wooden ship. Now that land is returning to forest, and in fact, this is generally true of the entire northeastern United States, and by that I mean Pennsylvania and New Jersey, New York State, and then the 6 New England states. The 6 New England states, northern New England is Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. Southern New England is Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, which is what is shown on this map. But in the end, a long story to say that keep in mind that only 3% of the United States is actually paved over, so to speak, in those urbanized areas. So there's still a lot of farmland, 97% of it. Farmland, pasture land, forestry land, desert, and so forth. We started the lecture, and we're almost near the end of this one, with tying it to physical geography in a sense, when I was talking about the winds and the wealthy people living on the west side instead of the east side because of the wind direction. Another way that urbanization and cities are connected with physical geography is through something called the urban heat island. This is a map showing the effect on Paris. Basically, and I'll show you on the next slide, I'll show you why. You can think of some of them already yourself, I'm sure. Cities are warmer than their surroundings, and this is a general rule. It's about 5 degrees. This particular one, maybe it was a certain day, or they picked a map that I thought this was a good map to show, but in this case, the difference from the outlying suburbs, which are 61 degrees, to the center of the city, 70 degrees, 9 degrees. That's a lot. It's not usually that much, but the map makes the point. It's usually about 5 degrees. So if you watch the weather on television or on the web, and you'll see that they'll say like, well, tonight it's going to be 20 in Columbus, but it's going to be 15 in the suburbs, and even the smaller cities like Lancaster or Zanesville or whatever. Small cities have tiny heat islands, but bigger cities have larger heat islands. And it means that cities are warmer than their surroundings. And the reason for that are many. And as I said, you probably can think of some. First of all, you have all the asphalt or tar. Black absorbs and retains the heat. And not just on the streets, but rooftops. And it's true, sometimes you see white reflective roofs, but generally most roofs are still black, so they attract heat. But actually, as big a factor is the fact of drainage over, let's say it rains 2 or 3 times in a typical week, a couple of times a week. In the suburbs and in forested areas and so on, all that rain acts to cool. It cools down after it rains, right? Finally, you had 95 degrees and now it's only 85. Whatever. So there's a cooling effect from that rainfall and from its evaporation. In the cities, you don't really get that, because as soon as the water hits the ground, where does it go? It goes into a sewer underground. And it's amazing how rapidly, once it stops raining and the sun comes out, like an hour later in a city, you never even knew it rained, because all that rain is gone. If you were still in the forest, that rain and that dampness would be around for, half a day or so. So that takes away the natural cooling effect of rainfall, because we put it underground and into the sewers pretty much immediately. And then, of course, you have the heat produced. Cities are dense, collection of machinery, right? Imagine how many automobiles are on the road, how hot those auto engines get. You have, if it's wintertime, you have heating. Imagine all those furnaces producing heat. And even in summer, of course, you realize, the air conditioning, you say, well, is air conditioning? Yeah, air conditioning takes it out of one space, but dumps the heat outside the building. And the net effect is that you're generating heat, which keeps it warm. Plus the buildings, the tall buildings trap, and I don't really want to say trap, but they bounce around solar radiation more than occurs naturally, like in a forest. So you get buildings, and sunlight gets reflected back and forth, and giving that sunlight more opportunity to warm things up. And it reduces the buildings, the presence of buildings, particularly tall buildings, reduces the natural cooling effect from wind. Now, it's also true, right? Chicago, the windy city. It is true that in certain areas, actually buildings can increase the wind. If you have a long avenue with a lot of tall buildings, I'll be walking down here when it's 5 degrees in the wintertime. So in particular areas that wind gets funneled. But the point is, when you look at it, down from a satellite, the point is, wind is coming in a certain direction. If you block it, the net effect is to reduce the cooling effect of that wind, even though in certain places the wind may get funneled between buildings or whatever. The effect of the urban heat island is true in both day and night. But the effect is more intense in the daytime. And of course, you have the sunlight there bouncing around among the buildings and so on. And lastly, I think this is the last slide. Back to perception and mental maps, and the textbook talks about this too with sports teams. Cities want to make a name for themselves. They want, the tourist industry wants you to go to St. Louis, and so it's almost like a competition among urban areas, not just in the United States, but in the world. You want your city known for things, so industry will locate there. People will want to come live there, shop there. Tourism will increase and so forth. And so you have a lot of distinctive city skylines, like the St. Louis Arch there. That top center picture is the Denver airport. It was designed that way. It's like a giant tent, really, and it was designed that way to look like the Rocky Mountains. Doesn't have to be spectacular architecture. You could have top right is New Orleans. That's Bourbon Street on the French Quarter. What's called the French Quarter of the city, a distinctive downtown area. Of course, we have the new World Trade Center in New York, just completed in 2014. Of course, here we have Paris, this very distinctive Eiffel Tower. London is so many things, it's hard to pick one, although I've got two in here. We have the Big Ben, the giant tower with the clock on the House of Parliament. And London has added this gigantic Ferris wheel, which a lot of cities are adding now, but we could have also had the the Tower of London, or a lot of the modern architecture that London has been building.